You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast. You're listening to Teka Teka News.
So we are in the midst of a global humanitarian funding crunch. In fact, WFP is in the midst of a crippling funding crisis that is forcing us to scale back life-saving assistance right as acute hunger is hitting record levels.
The world's largest humanitarian organization, the World Food Program, says it's running out of money. In this episode, we look at the cost of failing to fund the global fight against hunger.
The largest food and nutrition crisis in history today persists.
That's Carl Scow, Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Program, a United Nations agency established in 1961 and funded entirely by donations.
This year, 345 million people continue to be acutely food insecure, while hundreds of millions of people are at risk of worsening hunger.
The WFP defines food insecurity as a lack of access to food, threatening a person's life or livelihood. But what's causing it?
The causes of this food crisis are manifold: climate change and unrelenting disasters, and added pressure from persistent food price inflation and mounting debt distress or stress amid unexpected slowdown in the global economy. But conflict and insecurity remains a primary driver of acute hunger around the world. The impacts of armed conflict on food security can be direct, such as displacement from land, looting, or destruction of food stocks and agricultural assets. Indirect impact can include the disruption of food system and markets and decreases access to supplies necessary for food preparation, such as fuel and water. Many of the countries where WFP works are dramatic examples of the link between conflict and hunger. And unfortunately, these are countries with large numbers of people in need. Tragically, critical shortfalls of humanitarian funding is forcing WFP and other humanitarian partners to reduce or cut assistance, in our case, to make impossible trade-offs of prioritizing assistance.
How severe is the lack of funding exactly?
What we call our operational requirements are at $20 billion. That's what we could deliver and where to meet those in need of our services. We were aiming at somewhere between 10 and 14 billion because that was the number that we had seen in the past couple of years. We are still aiming at that, but we have only so far this year gotten to about half of that, around 5 billion. So that's where we are.
And the consequences of this sharp drop in donations are already being felt all over the world.
At least 38 of 86 WFP country operations have already seen cuts or plan to cut soon. The size and scope of life-saving food, cash and nutrition assistance programs. That is almost half of WFP's operations worldwide. And let me quickly just give you some examples. Afghanistan. In March, WFP was forced to cut rations from 75 to 50% for communities facing emergency levels of hunger. And in May, WFP was forced to make a 66% cut, 8 million people, to its caseload, now only assisting 5 million people. In Syria, we have cut assistance in July for 2.5 million people. Of the 5.5 million people, we rely on our support for basic food needs. And these 5.5 million were already on 50% rations. In Palestine, in June, WFP cut its caseload by 60% or 200,000 people. In Yemen, food assistance continue. We are also facing huge funding gaps and will be forced to scale down our work as early as next month with cuts for 7 million people across the country. And in West Africa, most of the countries in the region, Burkina, Mali, Chad, CAR, Nigeria, Niger and Cameroon, where acute hunger is on the rise, we are also cutting rations.
That's nearly 20 million people in critical areas who have lost or will soon lose access to life-saving food. But that's not all.
Less funding means WFP is forced to stop assisting people who are only in the hunger category of crisis level, This is so that we can save those who are literally starving or in the category of catastrophic hunger. But what happens is that those people who were in crisis now rapidly drop into the emergency or catastrophic categories. And so we will have an additional humanitarian emergency on our hands down the road if this continues. So we're entering a humanitarian doom loop where we save people who are starving at the cost of allowing millions of others to fall closer into that same category. Ration cuts are clearly not the way to go forward.
After a quick break, we look into what this might mean for the Philippines. The World Food Program has a significant presence in the Philippines too. The UN agency says 27%, or 1 out of 4 Filipino children, suffer from stunting, which means their height is low for their age due to malnutrition. This prevents them from reaching their physical and cognitive potential. Since 1968, the WFP has aided in the response to national disasters and armed conflicts here. In June 2023, WFP assisted 1,460 people and distributed nearly 900,000 pesos in cash. But the organization's primary strategy is to help the Philippine government increase its capacity. The WFP helped the Social Welfare Department prepare for the Walang Gutom 2027 food stamp program. The program's launch last July was led by President Bongbong Marcos. In short, these funding cuts are likely to affect us too. And the cuts to direct assistance are just part of the quote-unquote doom loop WFP executive Carl Scow talked about earlier. In addition to the lack of funding, a critical deal that allowed grain to be exported out of war-torn Ukraine recently fell through.
The collapse of the Black Sea Initiative is, of course, regrettable, to say the least. Under the initiative, WFP has shipped more than 725,000 tons of grain, relieving hunger in some of the hardest hit corners of the world, including Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. WFP relied on Ukraine, competitively priced, accessible, and high-quality source of wheat. Despite the war, and thanks to this accord, Ukraine remained WFP's biggest supplier of wheat in 22, supplying more than half of WFP's wheat grain. Losing this source is now of great concern, of course.
Since August 2022, 32.9 million metric tons of food have been exported from Ukraine as part of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It also helped decrease wheat prices by 17% and corn by 26%. The International Rescue Committee called the deal, quote, a lifeline for the 79 countries and 349 million people on the front line of food insecurity, unquote. But Russia, which has been waging war against Ukraine for over a year, pulled out of the accord in July.
The impact will be that we have to look for food elsewhere, which potentially can be more costly and certainly will have longer leadways. One of the reasons why Ukraine has been such an important source for us is the proximity to many of our operations, and that's why 50% of our grain came from Ukraine in 22, and already in 23, 80% of our wheat is coming from Ukraine. So we're actively now looking at other ways, but certainly it's going to take longer time. I think, and if you look across the UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations, the picture is the same. 21, 22 were exceptional years. The needs were going through the roof, of course, due to COVID and then to the war in Ukraine and its broader implications. But what's happening now is that those needs continue to grow. Those drivers are still there, but the funding is drying up.
The US is the WFP's largest donor by far. In 2022, it donated $7.2 billion to the UN agency. Meanwhile, Germany donated $1.8 billion, trailed by the European Commission and private donors, who donated over $500 million each.
It's clear that aid budgets, the humanitarian budgets, both in Europe and the United States, is not where they were in 21-22. That's why it is important to now step up efforts to explain also the implications of that. And those implications go beyond humanitarian, which is our main concern. But of course, this has destabilizing effects as well. It has direct security implications also for us when we make these very difficult prioritizations in countries. So we're looking at 24 even more dire, and while we are committed to knock every door, turn every stone possible to diversify our funding base, it will be important that our traditional donors step up and support us through this very difficult time.
Here's World Food Program Deputy Executive Director Carl Skau with the final word.
This is really about keeping the barn door open just when millions are knocking on it. The world needs unimpeded access to major food supplies. Global food security depends now on collective, urgent action. The hungry cannot wait for deliberations or diplomatic detours. My basic message here today is that world leaders must act to prioritize funding for humanitarian response, enhance coordination among aid organizations and governments, and invest in long-term solutions that can address the root causes of these crises, such as conflict, poverty reduction, and sustainable development.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you like this episode, please take the time to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.